Hello and welcome everybody. My name is David Pritchard and I'm an Associate Director of NPC. We'll just leave it a few seconds. People are entering the room and I encourage you, as some of you are doing, thank you, to introduce yourselves in the chat, and we'll just start in a minute or so. Okay, everyone, I think most people are in the room now. Welcome to all those who just joined. My name is David Pritchard. I'm Associate Director of NPC, and this is a NPC New Philanthropy Capital event. Hopefully you're in the right place. We're going to be talking about the feasibility of using CBA, cost benefit analysis, or SROI, to assess a portfolio. And I'm delighted to welcome some colleagues from University of Galway, Cormac Falcon and Tanya Kovacic, and Neil Stanworth from ATQ Consultants, who will also be sort of co-presenting with me. So I just encourage you all to introduce yourselves in the chat, so kind of know who's who. I assume that you're all familiar with some kind of cost benefit analysis and SORI. What we have is we have three presentations of organizations that have tried to use CBA or SORI to assess a portfolio of grants or investments. I think many of us are you'll be familiar with using CBA, SROI just for one program, one organization. But there's very little done in terms of actually using that method for portfolio. So this is quite a we think is somewhat innovative, and we thought it'd be nice to share experiences from organizations that have done that. So I'm gonna hand over in a few minutes to Neil Stanworth to talk about his experience with their analysis. What we're going to do is we're going to break this down into like three presentations, probably about 15 minutes, 20 minutes for each. And then we'll take some technical questions, then questions of clarification if you don't understand anything. And then we'll move on to the next presentation, next example. And then after those three, there should be 45 minutes, something like that, left for questions. So if you have questions, feel free to add them into the chat. We've got someone monitoring them, and they're going to we're going to be following them. Or when we get later, you can raise your hand on using the feature on the reactions button on your Zoom, and I'll call on you. So I think that is everything. So let me hand over to Neil.
Thank you, David. I think Gillian's going to manage my slides for me, which is very kind of her. I'm just waiting for us to come. So, there we are. Thank you. So I'll start by saying a very little bit about ATQ. ATQ is a very small consultancy. There's just two directors. My colleague Edward should be on this call with me. And we specialize in a number of things. We're advisors and researchers and evaluators. We do both those things, and we specialize in things that can be loosely put in the context of measuring social impact and helping people improve social impact. but one of the things we specialize in is cost benefit and cost value analysis of social outcomes contracts. So as David's already said, we, like others, are used to doing this for a single contract or a single group of contracts that all fits closely together. But I want to talk about an exercise we did that covered the entire sector in the UK. So next slide, please. I just wanted to start, I'm not sure everyone on the call will be familiar what social outcomes contracts are, but effectively they are a specialized way of delivering social interventions with which I suspect many people will be familiar, such as employability support, which has been around for 15 years or so now in the UK, therapeutic interventions and those sorts of issues, social interventions generally. But they're organized into payment by results contracts, so outcomes are specified and payments attached to them. And they're usually supported by external social investment, which is used to provide the working capital or sometimes all the capital that's needed to make the contract work. They're known and were originally known widely as social impact bonds, though social outcomes contracts is a term that's replacing that. There are many other terms around outcomes-based contracts, social outcomes partnerships, but essentially they all mean the same thing. And as I said earlier, one of the things we've specialized in is trying to put together a cost-benefit analysis for these types of contracts, often as advisors to people who are considering one of them and looking to know whether they will get payback from them, because one of the key selling points of these contracts was that they can wholly or partly pay for themselves through the returns that are made. But in recent years, increasingly in a ex post after contracts have finished, saying what value was actually achieved. And we've done quite a lot of work in that area for commissioners, local authorities, and for investors. And the origins of this project was that Big Society Capital wanted something bigger. So if we can go to next slide, please. So Big Society Capital, for those who don't know what it is effectively a wholesale social investor. It is effectively a social bank run by the government and funded by the money Gordon Brown found down the back of the sofa in dormant bank accounts, and then topped up with some money from some of the big banks as a sort of payback for all the help they got from Gordon when they all trashed the economy in 2009-10. So Big Society Capital have been supporting social investment in all its forms in England, particularly for a number of years. And they wanted to celebrate the fact that in 2022, we effectively got to 10 years of Sibs and Socks in the United Kingdom. But they had a secondary and quite transparent motive, which was to try and demonstrate the impact and value that had been achieved by those contracts to government, partly because government interest in them seemed to have waned. And they were keen to get the debate going about whether such contracts really were adding value. So they approached us and said, we know you do cost benefit analysis. We've spoken to investors who've told us you can do that. Can you do it for the whole market? So I gulped and said, yes, we probably could, and we did. I think it's important to say up front, because I think this is a thing that will come out later, is that we did it in a tearing hurry. We were originally given 3 months. It actually took 5 to do it. And it was very tight resource-wise. I think some of the people who've commented on our work assumed that we were paid 6 figures to do this work. It was effectively, I think, 20 to 25 days work. It was a very intense exercise, and that reflects some of the methodological things we did. So move to next slide, please. So yeah, the first thing we had to do was establish how many contracts we were. This was quite easy because the Government Outcomes Lab, which is part of the Blavatnik School of Government in Oxford and is part funded by Department for Culture, Media and Sport in England, have built a database of social outcomes contracts, which is an immensely useful resource for people like me. So we knew that there were roughly 90 projects, and they split down as shown there. There were 21 child and family welfare sector, 24 employment and training, 21 homeless. Those are very much dominant. And then a range of different things in health. I'm not going to talk too much about them. I'm happy to answer questions on the nature of the contracts, but that's what we were dealing with. And And then we had to look at how we were going to analyze that to answer some key questions. So if we could go to next slide again, please. So the questions we agree we wanted to answer with Big Society Capital were these. What was the value of the outcomes achieved by these contracts to national and local agencies, which in terminology that's become quite common in these, certainly in the sectors we work in, is direct fiscal value. In other words, did they achieve a saving that was actually, in the jargon, cashable, or did they avoid future costs by the outcomes that were achieved? And then what is the wider value to society from long-term improvement in life chances and reduced dependency? I'll talk a bit more about the difference between these two in a minute, but social value. And then what was the benefit to individuals, for example, from improved earning? Nearly all the benefit we did was in terms of improved earning capacity for individuals, either because of improved educational attainment or because of being in employment rather than NEET, those sorts of issues. Sometimes we're looking at wider community benefit, for example, local economy improvement, but that doesn't come up much in some of the contracts we looked at here. We also tried to put some confidence ratings on our estimates, and I'll say a bit more in a minute on why we had to do that. And we wanted to know how much value was created for each pound spent, which is the headline number that is often used and indeed is used in most social return on investment, how much back for every pound. So those were the things we were trying to get to the bottom of. So let's talk a bit more about how we did this. So next slide, please. So starting from those 90 projects, mainly from that GoLab database, as I mentioned earlier, we looked at them first to say, how many of these can we really model and work out, do the cost value analysis on? The crucial thing there is whether we could get data on them. A big advantage in this sector compared to others, compared to most cost benefit analysis that we've seen and indeed undertaken, is that we have great data on outcomes. So because these are outcomes contracts which explicitly measure the outcomes and pay money based on those outcomes, we know what the outcomes are. So we were able to go to the people who manage those contracts and say, can you give us that data? And most of them are managed as portfolios of investments by investment fund managers and intermediaries, notably three: Bridges Fund Management, Big Issue Invest, and Social Finance. So they had already been teed up by Big Society Capital to provide us with the data. So we were in a good position there. We got some others from public sources. There have been evaluations of some projects that we were able to get data on. We also eliminated some because they just didn't have usable data. They were too early stage, mainly. They'd only just started, so we didn't think there was much to go with there. We boiled it down to 76. And we then modeled those projects in order to establish what value was created and split it into those categories as shown. I think the only thing I want to say about that is that there are two key sources there which are quite challenging to get right. One is the evidence for the impact of the SOC. Some of that's measured directly by the contracts, but others we're reliant on research to say that the effect of outcome A will be outcome B. And to give an example, which is a relatively straightforward one, a lot of those child and family welfare contracts are about using therapeutic interventions to avoid children going into local authority care. So the contracts will directly measure in one way or another how much care has been avoided by those children not going into care. So relatively quickly and easily, we can establish a direct fiscal value of that care being avoided. But there are some more challenging areas, which is to estimate the consequential and secondary impact on those children of, for example, having better life chances later, being less likely to be NEET, being more likely to improve their educational attainment. There's good research on some of those things, but it's much more difficult and challenging to estimate that directly, as it often is in this sort of analysis. And the other thing is knowing what the costs avoided or the cost value created actually is. We use a wide range of sources, but we always say it's better to have local data. So if you can work with local stakeholders to work out what they know their own costs to be, you get much better data. But that is often impossible, and was certainly impossible for nearly all of this because of the scale. So we're reliant on national data. Fortunately, quite a lot of that is collected in and aggregated in one database, which was run by the Greater Manchester Combined Authority analysts and was paid for partly by government precisely to enable this sort of analysis to be done. And it's still a very useful source, though unfortunately it hasn't been updated for 3 years. So there's more work that we had to do to go and look at those. But that gave us most of what we needed. I'll talk later about some of the compromises we had to make, but that's what we did. So I'm going to talk very briefly about what we found out. So we can go to the next slide, please. So across the entire sector, those 76 projects, we calculated there was 1.46 billion of gross value created, and net value, i.e. if you take off the payments, the outcome payments that have been made in those contracts, it was 1.28 billion. And the most interesting number that everyone focused on, the fiscal value of that directly to the public sector, was just over 400 million. We were able to have high confidence in just over 800 million of that. And as I say, we got to a BCR of 10.2. So £10.20 return for each pound spent. An important point to make about that, I think, is that people would say that's a very big number and it looks like you've inflated it. And we were able to prove, and we put 40 pages of analysis in the back of our report to show that the opposite is the case. We made pessimistic assumptions. We only took the actual value created. We did not make any extrapolation. So to take that example earlier, if the contract measured how many weeks of care had been avoided, we did not assume any future value. If it said 9 months of care had been avoided, we took 9 months, even though we know that the average length of a child goes into care in England is 2.25 years. And it would be reasonably legitimate to say that that would be the likely care avoided. And by doing that and various other things, we tried deliberately to be pessimistic. And we told Big Society Capital we were going to do that, because we thought the analysis would only be credible if we did that. So just to say a tiny bit about how it breaks down. Next slide, please. Yeah, so as we expected, in fact, the ones that made the biggest return were child and family welfare, because there are more contracts in that area, and because the avoidance of care, the reunification of children already in care, the movement of children from high-cost residential care to lower-cost fostering care all create enormous direct fiscal value. And the other big sector is employment and training, which is simply because there are a lot of contracts in that area and many that have been funded by government. The others are smaller. I'm not going to talk about those. If people have questions on them, then I'm happy to answer them. Just to highlight, in criminal justice, we struggled, even though the very first SIB in the UK was in the criminal justice space in Peterborough Prison, because the data is thin and we had no data on what those schemes would actually cost. And we're trying to rectify that at the moment. What I do want to say a very small amount about in my last couple of minutes is some of the challenges and some of the benefits we've found of doing it this way. So if we can go to the last slide, please. So on the upside, I've already mentioned, we had data. I suspect the other speakers may say that they found it a bit more difficult. By definition, a social outcomes contract has contracted outcomes, and we had relatively consistent data on outcomes achieved. And we also had access to those delivery managers, the fund managers, the intermediaries who own that data and relatively easily could share it with us. Unless data is collected, that's often not the case. And one of the questions I've been asked since we did this analysis is, how would it compare with conventional contracts or grant-funded interventions? And I've said, I have no idea, because I wouldn't be able to get data on those sorts of contracts or those sorts of grant-funded schemes that I could compare. So one of the real upsides is having that data. But on the downside, we had to make some compromise. We analysed maybe 20 projects in the child and family welfare space that all are broadly similar, but they do slightly different things. They address different cohorts at different stages in the cycle of being on the edge of care, as it's sometimes called. They use different interventions. They had different demographic factors involved. So there's clearly we're assuming similarity between projects that we wouldn't have done if we'd been looking at a single project. So we had to make some shortcuts. We were very transparent in our report about those shortcuts, but they do exist. And as I hinted earlier, there was some unrealistic expectations in some people saying, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? And I said, well, if you give me a year and £100,000, I'll do it, but not on what we had. And the other thing, which is an important point, is that it is very challenging to estimate the impact, the true impact attributable to these interventions. And we're very transparent and say we hadn't done that. In other words, we hadn't looked at true impact evaluation and the net impact compared to business as usual, unless we had data. In some of these projects, we do have that data, and in some others, an attempt has been made to estimate it in the way the projects are put together. So where that was available, we used it, but in many cases, we couldn't. Where we do this on an individual project, we would make that estimate one way or another, working with stakeholders to say how much of this would have happened anyway, so that we get a true measure. But we didn't do that. And again, we're trying to address that in our rework, but it will still be rough and ready. And we've already made that clear. It is not possible to do it for 76, or possibly when we redo it, 85 projects without far, far more work than we were able to do, and far, far more data than we were able to get our hands on. But just to finish, I'd say we were very pleased with the response we got to this report, because Big Society Capital's aim was to provoke debate. It wasn't trying to get a perfect answer to a difficult question. I sense that BSc had asked some academics and others to do this exercise, and they'd said it would take a long time, it would be very difficult, they couldn't come to exact answers. What they really wanted was something where the perfect was not the enemy of the good. They wanted to move the debate forward and get something out there that people could work with and say, that's an interesting starting point, perhaps, for further research or more detailed analysis. So from that level, it was very well received, and we think it has had some benefits. Anyway, that's the end of my presentation. I think we're going to take a few technical questions if there are any, but otherwise move on to the next stage. So.
Thank you very much, Neil. Appreciate that. You'll see some contrast to when I talk about the CCSF project for sure. As I explained at the beginning, for those of you who came a little bit later, we're going to go through each presentation and then take sort of five minutes or so for any sort of technical questions or questions of clarification, and then leave kind of some of the bigger questions and more discussion up to the end. So here's your opportunity to ask anything, Neil, that was maybe not quite clear, or just want to probe while it's on your mind. John from PBE, I think you had a question about impact that maybe Neil might have answered. Do you want to?
Yeah, I think Neil addressed that just at the end. It was that question about to what extent they were able to look at attribution and the evidence around that, and Neil picked that up on his last slide.
Yeah,
so thank you.
Just to say, it is more possible than you think. We analyze. I mean, we did the analysis last year, and when people said, well, you didn't do that, I said, well, we did do it where it was available. And in many of these contracts, what people do, and we've done it ourselves, is people just aren't prepared to fund an impact evaluation. And some of the biggest experts in this field have been tasked of creating a robust comparator and have been unable to do so anyway because of confounding factors. So it doesn't get done very often. But what they often do is to make an allowance for it. So there are contracts where they say, we're not going, in those edge of care contracts, they say, we're not going to pay for the first 30% of the outcomes because we know that there's a likely non-attribution dead weight there. So we took that into account in our analysis. That makes sense.
Yeah, thanks, Neil. It does beg the question, I won't get into this now, it does beg the question of kind of how the payments were made if there wasn't an impact evaluation of credible quality. But anyway, that's maybe a bit of a later discussion. Tom, you've got a question. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask that?
Yeah, sure, thanks. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Great. Hi, thanks, Neil. Yeah, I really enjoyed the presentation. Really novel for me actually to understand. I'm Tom, I'm head of research data and insight at the Heritage Fund. Yeah, just really interested if there's any reflections on how Big Society Capital have used the cost-benefit ratios to think about decision making in their portfolio a little bit differently, or how the evidence has perhaps changed how they think about the investments.
That's a great question. I don't think it has actually. They don't invest directly anymore. They did in some of the early stages. What they do is, as what's technically a wholesale investor, is they put 10 million. So they put 10 million into a fund, and Bridges Fund Management put another 10 million in from other investors. But that's all managed by Bridges. BSC expects some minimum returns, but they don't make. But it is influencing some others' decisions. We've had some contact with a new fund in Sweden, which are very interested in our report because they think it gives them some heads up on where the real value lies and what are the things you can really go after and get municipalities in Sweden interested in. And it's also interesting that all the when we started the exercise, the fund managers, Bridges and BII, were very reluctant to share. Say we don't want this data shared. We don't want people comparing our performance with others. There are lots of reasons why some of these are done very well and others not. But they all immediately afterwards said, "Can you give us the analysis for our own contracts, please?" Because they wanted to use it, and they've certainly used some of it internally and also in some of their marketing literature. So to say, according to this analysis, we've created this value. But it does beg that point that David's already picked up. We're looking at gross value. We're not looking at value net of a robust impact evaluation, which I'm happy to discuss more later. It's one of my pet subjects, bugbears. But Big Society Capital, no. Others possibly yes. Is the answer to that, I think.
All right, thanks, Neil. I'd like to move on. The question of utilisation of those results is a big one, and maybe come up later in the discussion. So thanks very much, Neil. Appreciate that. I'd like to move on to Cormac Falcon and Tanya Kovacic from University of Galway to talk about their experience. And I just want to say here, I know that I'm guessing there's a mix of people on the people sort of research and economics experience on the call. If you do have any questions about it, so some things might get sort of terminology used or methodology assumed. Do feel free to put the questions in chat if you're not quite clear on anything, just to try to make it as accessible to everybody. But anyway, let me hand over to Cormac and Tanya.
So hello everyone. I hope you can see this presentation. So just if you can give me a nudge if you can see that, that would be great. But we are two academics. We come from University of Galway. So we are Cormac Falcon and Tanya Kovacic. We come from UNESCO Child and Family Research Center. And we are going to present basically how we applied social return of investment study on Rethink Ireland's education fund. And just on the right side of this slide, you can see the report that we published as a result of this study, and you can access it on our website. So you can see how we actually utilized social return of investment and how we also incorporated it in other findings that we found in connection to our research. So just to give you a little bit of a very quick insight who we are, so what the center is doing. So the UNESCO Child and Family Research Center's core mission is basically to help create the conditions for excellent policies, services, and practices that improve the lives of children, youth, and families through research, education, and service development. So the center has a long history of actually working with different organizations in the area of youth and families. And we encountered Rethink Ireland on our long journey. And that's why we're here today to actually present the work that we have completed for Rethink Ireland, and to show you how basically our study is first of its kind to be completed in Ireland at this scale, on so-called fund scale. But before we go into it, we have to acknowledge some other people that help us actually to bring this evaluation to an end. So particularly, we would like to acknowledge support of our colleagues, Professor Pat Dolan and Dr. Leonor Rodriguez, who heavily contributed to this research. Tim Goodspeed, a consultant in Social Value UK, he was very important actually in developing some parts of social return investment part. And then also some people from Rethink Ireland, in particular, Martina von Richter, Deirdre Mortel, Jessica Curtis, and other colleagues. So just to give you a bit of a background and context of what we are talking about here. So basically, Rethink Ireland is a national organization which supports high-quality social innovation projects through cash grants and provides business support for each of these. So basically, the organization focuses on different social areas, and they're looking for innovative solutions to persistent social problems. So as part of these areas, they focus also on education. They opened so-called education fund in the period of 2017 and 2020. This education fund was open to projects focused on improving educational outcomes for those experiencing educational disadvantage, we would actually call it rather educational inequality, and which specifically supported learners to progress from levels 3 to 6 on the national framework of qualifications. So basically, these projects would very much support those young people who would live or in persistent inequality, socioeconomic disadvantage, experiencing mental health issues, or maybe having other problems, such as, for example, intellectual disabilities, or being return students in their adult years. So as part of it, the fund was opened in that period. 10 projects were selected as part of the fund, but 7 projects in the end completed the Rethink program, including a 3-year academic-led evaluation.
Tanya,
yeah.
David here. Your slide shows the whole screen. Is it possible to show it from the presentation?
Can you see it like this? Yeah.
Yeah, that's better. That's better.
Okay.
Just if you go back one slide, just because I think we couldn't quite see.
Yeah. So apologies for that. I just the button didn't function previously. So just to give you a feeling, basically, you see here you have a level from 3 to 6, right? Very much this could be corresponding, let's say, to the second level education, and very much there were very different projects involved in this fund that were, as I said, supporting students of different complex needs or different socioeconomic backgrounds and so on. So just to give you a little understanding about the background. Now, I'm not going to go too much into this slide, but just to give you a feeling. So when we were introducing social return on investment framework, that framework is usually used on a project level, on one project level. So in this situation, we use the framework on a fund level. So we try to do a macro evaluation focused on all 7 projects. In order to actually operate or to try to even understand what's going on across these projects, we first had to actually categorize projects in different clusters. So basically, we developed so-called project models. We analyzed the data, documented data from these projects, and we developed 3 clusters of projects, just that we were able actually to operate with the projects on a daily basis through research and through management point of view. So 3 clusters, very briefly, we divided them into lifelong learning and social inclusion. This cluster very much kind of focused on more adult education, and a project which focused on kind of young adults with intellectual disabilities. The second cluster projects were basically projects that provided support to students in socioeconomic disadvantaged areas. These are so-called DASH schools in Ireland. And basically these programs support young people in these socioeconomic disadvantaged areas, mainly in schools or together with schools on their pathways to education. And the third cluster is very much a typical alternative education cluster, which is based outside of the mainstream education and supports those students who would otherwise experience early school leaving or similar kind of situations. So the background very quickly, why is actually focus on education so important for Rethink Ireland? So over the last 10 years, actually, Ireland has experienced high completion school rates with over 90% of students completing their leaving certificate. So, you know, statistics is actually quite good if you put it like this. But there is the question, what does it happen to this 8 to 10% of students, right? How is actually dealt with this population? And the second really important finding through other research is that basically educational progression is higher among those who come from middle to upper class, let's say, backgrounds. So there is a considerable gap in school completion across different socioeconomic communities. And a new finding is also that there are new issues connected with educational inequality. For example, mental health and well-being can be one of those. So we also figure out that there is a significant number of children supported by so-called alternative education services, by those programs that were mentioned through the clusters, but that these actually services are largely hidden sector of the Irish post-primary provision jigsaw. So basically, the Department of Education might not put them on the education map as such. And these programs basically operate nearly in isolation. So we don't even know how many programs are out there, what's the scope of the problem and so on. So if we don't document these things, then we actually don't even know what we are dealing with. So we do know that there is actually a sector about which there is very little known about. So the why of our study, then going back to the evaluation. So Rethink Ireland very much kind of said that they want to kind of have a study that would kind of that they kind of have in their statement that there are many not-for-profits in Ireland innovating in different sectors, the collection of outcome data and implementation of outcome measurement tools that are not widely adopted. So these outcome measurement tools were not widely adopted in an Irish context. So very much there was a need inside of the organization, recognized need that basically there should be a more social impact data recognized in an Irish context. And an overarching aim of the evaluation of the education fund was then to investigate the extent to which practices and processes utilized by overseas can serve as a model of excellence in overcoming inequality in education. And as I mentioned already previously, so we incorporate social return on investment framework on the fund level, on a macro focus, and this was done for the first time in an Irish context. And I'm going to pass it on to Cormac now.
Thanks very much, Tanya. We're delighted to be here just to tell you about our study. So I'll just continue on building on what Tanya has said to you already. The nature, I suppose, of the community voluntary sector would be, in terms of their daily activities, is that obviously they can create social value, but they can also destroy value. And that's what Tanya was talking about, was that sense of knowledge, or that sense of understanding of that process, if you like, was never documented from an Irish perspective. So as part of the support program that Rethink Ireland offered the 7 projects, one of the things that they did with them was to develop a theory of change, to try and document their inputs and their outputs and their overall kind of theory of change and so on, which is a very detailed process for them to go through because they had never kind of done that before. And when you think about that and the position of the projects, it put them in a good position then to engage in an SROI study. So in terms of the initial benefit for them was that if we could create an evidence base from their projects and so on, they could then use that evidence to do more good. So they could design their interventions, design their programs, interrogate their existing theory of change over time to see how they could improve and review and evaluate and so on, as you would expect. But they didn't have that data. So this was the first kind of set of data that they would have been provided with. And then at the broader level that we'll come back to later is that Rethink Ireland and ourselves were very interested in the beginning about, well, what happens when you bring all of this together? Tanya mentioned it at the start, is that up to this point, there was no coalition of voices, if you want to call it that, data available, or coalition of evidence on this particular area. So if you think about it from a policy-making perspective, you might have had information from Project X or Project Y, but you mightn't have been able to understand it from a coalition perspective or from a fund level. So the SROI helped us to think through that particular question as well. So Tanya, I'll go on to the next slide, please. Tanya, if you want to move me on to the next slide.
Yeah, I just can't move it.
Maybe there, yeah. So then in terms of the how of our study, what we did was, this is just to give you a summary of it. Obviously, be familiar with this process, but just to give you the gist of it. So the SROI took part over a 3-year period and so on. And what was included in the scope was obviously the particular piece of our intervention that was funded by Rethink Ireland. We identified with each project their set of stakeholders using the stakeholder involvement plan template and so on, and then conducted a set of qualitative interviews and qualitative focus groups where we collected the data on each project and so on, and then subjected that to an analysis where we identified the well-defined outcomes. We then obviously converted that into a quantitative measure, where we then went back and surveyed each project with their participants and so on to investigate the nature of the value of these outcomes, as you'd expect. So next slide, Tanya, please. So
For some reason, it doesn't kind of click, so I don't know why.
Okay, see if you can. Oh, there you are. So one of the things that we were very conscious of, and this is something that Tim Goodspeed was crucial for us and Lena Rodriguez in thinking through this, was because of the peculiarity of the Irish context. So if you think about it, we have always had a net outward migration. So we've always had more people going than arriving. We've had a very poor economic structure at particular periods in our history and so on. So we thought that when we looked at the proxies that are used for the actual calculations, we kind of came to the conclusion that because of those contextual differences and so on, that it would be good to develop an Irish anchor, Irish proxy for financial proxy for the SROI calculations. So we went about that work where we developed an anchor based on self-confidence. And the method we used, we can talk about that later, the method we used was the well-being valuation, which we spent a lot of time looking at the HAT database and kind of what is done there, how it was done and so on. And we eventually arrived at a figure on self-confidence. So self-confidence, as we'll see in a minute, was the most common well-defined outcome. So we use that as the anchor to develop. And obviously, as you can see here, the figure represents the increased amount of income someone would need in a year in order to get the same increase in their happiness, well-being, or quality of life that they experienced as a result of increased confidence. So it was all new to us to develop this process, but it was very interesting from the comparability perspective across different jurisdictions. So Tanya, if you want to try the next slide.
Delay in.
That's okay. It'll go. There you are. Thank you. So the key SROI findings then. So here, what you have is our list of well-defined outcomes valued and the value for each one of these well-defined outcomes. So really what you can see is at the very top, you have the top 6 really well-defined outcomes and their values. So you can see that even though that increased self-confidence wasn't the most valued, it was the most common across all fund levels. That was interesting to see what was the common theme that ran through all of them. And you can see the kind of the way that they tailored off then as we went down through the calculations. So Tanya, you can go on to the next one, please. So in relation to the actual SROI findings themselves then, when we did the calculations, the total value that we found for the overall fund, for the education fund, was 68 million. Now, just to say, this is the first time this was ever done from an Irish perspective, where a set of projects in this education sector, alternative sector, were brought together and valued in this particular way. The total cost was 7.7 million, as you can see, for the 7 awardee projects over the 3 years. So then the actual return on investment was in the range of 1:9. And then for Rethink Ireland themselves, 55% of that social value was directly created through the investment of Rethink Ireland of the 4.3 million, which gave Rethink Ireland a return of 1:12. Now, just to say an important point, we can pick up on it later as well, is that in order to avoid league tables, and Neil mentioned it earlier on, what we did was, instead of publishing the individual return scores or total value for each project in the main report, what we decided to do was to issue each project afterwards with an individualized SROI report. So that report contained the core information about the context and their overall theory of change and what their calculations were at the end. So that was an added thing that we decided to do as we kind of progressed through the process, because we wanted to avoid comparing apples and oranges, really, because even though they were all working in a similar area, similar sector, they were very much like apples and oranges, and were not comparable in any particular way, directly. So in relation to the overall thoughts on all of this, what does it actually tell us? And we'll go through this, and we can obviously pick up as we go. But Neil's kind of question to us when we started thinking about this webinar was, to think about, is it a good idea to use SROI at the fund level? So Tanya and I have kind of put a good bit of thinking into this. So in terms of the positives, Tanya, like one of the things that we found was that stakeholders' voice is very much at the centre, and the SROI expresses that currency of social value, and that's the first time that has been done. So isn't that was fair to say that was a really strong positive?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the framework, the SROI framework, very much brings stakeholders' voice to the fore, to the center. So very much asking, people what is important to you as a part of the program. That was very, very important, and it really came to the fore.
Yeah.
I think the second one, Cormac, that was really interesting is also this developmental nature of the SROI, right? That projects, just on a project level, projects basically were kind of like able to see how their practice can develop in future, and they were able to compare their own theory of change outcomes with well-defined outcomes as we kind of developed them together with the participants. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. So just to say, we found about an 80% mismatch between the theory of change outcomes that have been developed by the project staff or management, and the actual well-defined outcomes that were identified by the participants. So there was a lot of learning there for projects around the next kind of steps and so on, which brings us on to the next point about, the figures are then, even though there are issues and obviously caveats around what does this mean and so on, the fact that fund level was created and that fund level knowledge was created, the figures are really useful then in theory for research and policy informed decisions, which is something that obviously we'll come on to in a minute. And the fourth one, Tanya, is something that really was of great learning for us as well as we went through this, was the conversion of something social, something of social value into monetary terms through the SROI that could level the playing field between disciplines. So it was no longer a case of the poor relations of the social scientists or community and voluntary sector going to government with qualitative only data, but that now we had something that was understood universally in terms of monetary language. So that was interesting, wasn't it?
That was very interesting, and it was also missing in the literature and other research that we looked at, particularly in so-called alternative education. I think particularly this monetary language was missing there. So there were some kind of like soft outcomes identified before, but never in such a robust way. So I think this is a great contribution to the literature as well.
Yes, and just quickly, point 5 there is that Rethink's work and Rethink Ireland's support for this particular approach has created 2 other funds that we're working on with them as well, which is leading to a pathway for collective action for this particular sector. So that's really important. So the challenges then from the SROI perspective that we have seen and that we're grappling with as we go on is, the first one is, obviously the SROI figures are not absolute, so that they're not a perfect representation, but they do translate people's social values into something that's understandable and so on. But the biggest challenge, Tanya, we've had really in the way that it's been reported in the media and understood is that the value is the one that's always given, whereas our suggestion, and it's a challenge, is that figure needs to be read together with the qualitative evidence.
Absolutely. That qualitative evidence, I think, very much tells way more about people's stories, also about their context in which they live. If we present only the number, I think we're missing the context. And it has to be definitely read together with qualitative part, and SROI actually allows us to do that. So it is more of an interest why the audience always picks the number. That's maybe something to discuss.
Absolutely. The second challenge we've had is just literally the sustainability for the projects themselves. The evaluation methodology was co-developed with ourselves, Rethink Ireland, and the awardee projects, with the view that when we were finished, that projects would be able to engage in this process themselves because of the level of expertise that's involved in it. For example, from the data collection to the analysis, developing the anchor, the value maps, and so on. There's a reticence, obviously, and an issue with projects being able to do this work and so on. So there's an issue here about knowing how to use their individualized data, what it means, when to use it, and so on. So there were some projects there, Tanya, that were more invested than others, but that was definitely a problem.
Absolutely, and again, maybe it was also an issue because it was a fund level evaluation. So SROI is usually used more on a project level as such. So there is a question how to actually continue sustainability on a project level when we are engaged on a fund level evaluation, but still trying to give something to the project.
And just the last 2 points there kind of roll into each other in a way is our question is, what's the actual impact of this SROI data on policymaking process? There has been a parallel development with the Department of Education here to review alternative education, but we have had no direct knowledge yet or evidence to say that the SROI figure has actually been taken on by government to make any real decisions. So our suggestion there will be additional studies, like we've talked about already with the other work from Rethink Ireland, but also the longitudinal tracking of participants in particular around their social value would help us to think through some of those challenges as we go on. And the last figure is just the direct comparison at a fund level is not appropriate. We feel very much between projects because of the different size and costs and needs and so on. So we'd be very much adamant that that's a challenge that is taken on as these figures kind of become appropriate. So just to finish, the last 3 points very much relate to structure. And obviously, as Tanya said at the beginning, we're sociologists, we're interested in how things happen around us in terms of social structure and so on. And we recognize very strongly that the measurement evaluation that we've engaged in over the last number of years does help us to think through the issue of funding and maximizing social impact. That's not a question. But the point here is that there is a shift then, if that becomes the focus, there's a shift that has been talked about in the literature and that we've experienced ourselves, a potential shift where policymakers then will invest only in high volume output or high volume outcomes rather than universal services. And that's an ethical issue that we're grappling with and concerned about a little. And finally, is if you think about the Education Fund and think about Rethink Ireland, what they're trying to do and what we've been working with them on is around systemic change, trying to improve the lives and outcomes for those that have been less fortunate in terms of education. Now, de St. Croix talks about, from King's College, talks about this idea of, you know, when you use SROI alone, it normalizes the idea of investment being in children's lives to help change their attitudes, behaviors, or feelings, without necessarily recognizing the wider social inequalities, you know, that really put them in that position in the first place. So as sociologists, the structure of society has to be part of this neoliberal structure that we live in, has to be part of the analysis and the thinking around how to use SROI. And in particular, we've tried to do that through our own methodology, where we've used a socioecological model as well as the SROI to try and understand the nature of people's work. So I know we're on time or just a little bit over time, so we better leave it there. Thank you very much for joining us, and if you have any questions, we'd be happy to take them now.
Thank you very much, Tanya and Cormac. So I've kind of got one question. I don't know if any others have. Could you just say a little bit about the source of the data that you use to value the outcomes? You had a kind of list of slide, like a list of points about sort of, obviously self-confidence was one, but you know, employment outcomes and things like that. you talked about the voice of the beneficiary being strong. Was it all sort of survey-based, self-reported data? Was it a mix of data that underlies those?
Yeah, so one of the points that we made there was that this education fund, the first fund that we worked on with Rethink Ireland, because it was newly introduced at the time to that particular fund, the decision was made only to gather data from the participants in the actual projects themselves. So there were no other stakeholders involved in this particular study, whereas in subsequent studies we've involved broader stakeholders as well to get a kind of a broader view of it. So that's the first thing. So what happened, David, was once we got the well-defined outcomes identified, we then converted that into a survey that sent that back out to the whole set of respondents and participants in projects to ask them to value those outcomes and to talk about the duration of the impact, the usual things that you'd expect to find in the SROI study, and then use the anchor then to develop the overall value for those particular outcomes. So that was the overall kind of process in a nutshell.
Great, thank you. And you also gave a figure between the sort of the match of the outcomes expected by or in the theory of change by the staff, and how they match to the participants' observation. Can you repeat what that measure was? Because I wasn't.
Yeah. So what we did was very interesting, was that a lot of the projects, when they were working with Rethink Ireland, they developed their theory of change with their set of expected outcomes, short, medium, and long-term outcomes, in their own way, in their own kind of language, and as expected according to what they were set up to do. So if Project X was set up to do whatever, then they had a set of outcomes associated with that. So say that there were 5 outcomes that they wanted to achieve. But what we actually found is, when we looked at the outcomes that were most valued by the participants, we found that there was a crossover for sure with the formal outcomes, if you like, expressed by management and what participants found. But there was a huge mismatch then. We estimated about 80% of the outcomes were mismatched. So in other words, that they were different for participants to what the actual project set out to do. So that there was an undercurrent, if you like, of this is what we're set up to do from a project perspective, but actually there's a lot more going on for participants that we found that projects didn't even know that they were achieving, that wouldn't have come to light only for the SROI analysis. So that then allowed the projects to go back and reinterrogate their theory of change in a positive sense, to say, well, how could we support this, that, or the other outcome now that has come to the fore that we didn't necessarily know was of value to the participants.
Great, thank you. Okay, so it's 80% mismatch, not 80% match. Okay.
No mismatch. Yeah.
And maybe if I can just add one thing, just for example, the main outcome, which was independence, maturity, right? None of the, let's say, project coordinators actually envisaged this as an outcome in their theory of change, and this was recognized as the most important outcome for the participants. So it's quite interesting how SROI can help us actually to find these discrepancies between what we want for the participants and what the participants then value most as an outcome.
Thank you both. Any more questions, technical questions before we move on? Okay, great. Well, there'll be plenty of opportunities to come back and talk further. So the last presentation will be my own of work that we did for the National Community Lottery Fund. I think our client Tamsin, I think, is still on the call. Welcome, Tamsin. And it's for the Coronavirus Community Support Fund. So give me a second here. Let me just present that. Okay. So, anyone good? Neil, can you see that slide? Give me a thumbs up there. Oh, great, fantastic, thank you. So, I want to set the context, because we did this back in sort of 2019, 2020, 2021. And I'm going to take you back to May 2020. I know you don't want to go there. I'm sure you don't want to go there, but let me do that. yeah, the sort of first lockdown already happened. Great concern that the frontline charities were at risk of losing funding because they couldn't actually deliver services as they had accustomed to. They couldn't really engage in any fundraising activities.
David,
Yeah.
I think I'm sharing slides for you. Do you want me to go to the next slide, or would you prefer to share them?
Oh, I see. Which one are you on? I thought I was sharing. I should be on the one that says May 2020.
May 2020. Would you prefer to share them yourself, or shall I continue to share for you?
You can. I'm happy to share.
All right, I'll stop sharing. Here we go. If you could just share again. There we go.
Okay.
Perfect. You're on.
All
Sorry
right.
about that. My fault.
Sorry about that, everyone. Okay. Yeah, I was looking at my screen, I guess, not your screen. So the NCVO sort of estimated that the charity sector was going to lose 3.7 billion, over 12 weeks. And in response, the government put together a package of funding. And you're probably familiar with this, to support the charity sector through this sort of transitionary period, of which 187 million was allocated to the Coronavirus Community Support Fund, and that was going to be used sort of to try to, that was used to try to sort of help prop up the charity sector and help them respond to the crisis. And at the same time, a lot of those organizations were doing their own fundraising and matching that funding to some degree as well. And that's just one technical question that kind of actually made it a little bit complicated, because it kind of confounded what we meant by the cost of the service. Was it just the 187 million, or was it 187 million plus? And I will get into that. Gillian, could you just confirm I've moved on to another slide now? Is that?
Yes, all good.
Good. All right, thanks. So in contrast to the others, I know, Neil, you talked about 76 projects, and there are sort of less than a dozen, I think, in Ireland. There are 8,247 grants made, right? So we're talking huge numbers. To a lot of small, medium-sized organizations, primarily to serve different purposes. Really, one is the first to continue, so they could continue to operate. As I said, they were losing funding. The second is so that they could actually change their services to correspond to kind of the new requirements, how they could deliver services. And then the third is to actually increase the demand as well. So demand for services going up at the same time as reducing funding. And not surprisingly, of these three purposes, they were sort of doing a sort of a mix of them. Only a few of them did one or the other. More than half were sort of trying to do two or more of these. So that was kind of one complicating factor. And the other issue, a big complicating factor, is the breadth of the different sectors that they were working in. From providing frontline material support, we're talking from food banks and delivery, to providing sort of educational support services when schools were kind of closed, to providing personal care services when a lot of them, the normal mechanisms weren't available, but also a lot of information advice and signposting as well, which slightly problematic for us, because it meant that these organizations, there was a supply. I get there was a sort of how people reached organizations, services. These weren't mutually exclusive, collectively or exhaustive, right? These weren't meaty outcomes. So some kind of duplication, overlap. Some people signposting to other organizations, things like that. So it was kind of, and that was another complicating factor for us. It wasn't necessarily a straight set of services that were all independently of each other. And they're also providing a wide range services to a wide range of people, really, across the board, really. A lot of concern about mental health and hardship, but also from some very sort of more niche areas of concern: homelessness, substance misuse, asylum seekers, people at risk of domestic violence, and so on. So, as well as some universal services as well. With also a wide range of outcomes. Well, big focus on mental health and well-being, and social contact and loneliness. You can see those three, that's roughly the dominant outcomes. But also kind of across the board as well, there what they were achieving. I should just say at this point that these results that I'm presenting here came from actually a survey that made up a big part of the methodology. So these were sort of somewhat predefined by the grantees, the 8,000 grantees. They were asked kind of, what do you think, what were the outcomes that you were seeking to achieve? So it was not purely sort of only self-reported. These were groups that they responded to, but really just a very wide, diverse group of services across these 8,000 grants. In addition, as well as the impact on beneficiaries, which was the sort of a key factor, of course, there was also concern about the staff as well, and volunteers. And it's partly because the concern about the loss in fundraising might lead to an exodus of staff, people going on furlough or even leaving the sector, and then the loss of knowledge and experience that would have on top of the loss of direct services. So there was a genuine concern that this might be a sort of a structural problem, not simply just a short-term funding problem. So the grants, a lot of the grants were used to actually keep people on staff, to not have them leave or go on furlough, but also increase volunteer opportunities. There was now a new supply of volunteers available because of the lockdown. So there were 25% of 183,000 were sort of new volunteers for those organizations. So there's kind of the value being created to the volunteers for this as well was another issue of concern. And then finally, so there were three impacts we were looking at: the beneficiaries that I've talked about, the staff and the volunteers, and then also the National Community Lottery Fund, DCMS, who were the sort of funders of this, were really also interested in the use of public services. To what extent did propping up the charity sector or helping them manage their services, improve their services, or change their services, respond to demand, how did that influence the use of public services as well? All within the rubric of kind of saying, does this provide, does the CCSF provide good value for money? So a massive question, a massive project, lots of complexities, caused us to sort of have to sort of think hard and long and hard. And so what did we do in response to this? I mean, these are all terrific questions, right? I guess first is absolutely right questions to ask: is this good value for money? You're putting $187 million, pounds, sorry, into this. I mentioned dollars because I'm actually based in the US. I didn't mention that at the beginning. So, you know, is this good value for money? So we did two things. The first thing is we researched the literature, say who has done this in terms of assessing sort of a cost-benefit analysis on such a wide scale at a portfolio level, and we found very little, almost nothing. And in fact, that was one of the impetus for doing this this event, was to find out, okay, if you know, what can we learn from people who are doing this for a portfolio as a whole. So that's the first thing we did. We sort of scoured the literature. The second thing we did as good researchers was formed an advisory group, an expert group, people to help us. Dan Curry, who's Chief Executive of NBC, is on the call, but also Jeff White, George Barrett, and John Mohan as well, all sort of experienced in the sector. And most helpful because we we use this group to sort of talk through a lot of complex issues. And give the spoiler alert here, in that our best estimate of the benefits cost ratio, much lower than the ones we've seen, reckon falls between 1.38 1.86. And I'm going to get into why that might be considered low, but we did some sensitivity around it, and it could be within 0.37 to about 4.46 when we're just considering the 187 million. If we include CCSF funding as well, that change it a little bit. But so there's quite a wide range there, and I'll kind of explain why that. And that would really to affect because of the level of uncertainty. So we included at various stages in the process opportunities to have sort of minimum and maximum, or upper bound and lower bound estimates of various calculations. Getting into challenges, I mean, a lot of the challenges that Neil and Tanya and Cormac talked about can be applied to sort of general cost-benefit analysis, SROI models, and we face the same things. First of all, conceptual, making sure there's clear understanding of what cost-benefit is, deciding about what to include and exclude, how to deal with the evidence, the uncertainty. So quite different, I think, from the social outcome contracts. We had very weak data. What time frame to consider, how the results were used. These were all fairly sort of common methodological issues. The ones that I think were really particularly notable for us was just the size and the complexity. As of 8,000 grants, what do you do with that? That's a huge thing. And the possible interaction effects as well. I mentioned about the role of IAG services on top of direct frontline services. They are clearly mixed in a way that make it you can't do those independently. You have to think about how they consider they work together. Just on the first issue, there's a bit of a side issue that I mentioned about. Question was value for money was our primary question here. And in fact, we only use cost-benefit analysis as one criteria for value for money. That's one at the bottom of this chart. This shows the relationship between different criteria for assessing value for money using the National Audit Office's economy, efficiency, effectiveness, cost effectiveness, as well as the Treasury's sort of cost-benefit analysis, cost effectiveness as well. So the ones in green were the ones criteria we used. The ones in grey, the ones that we didn't use but acknowledged. And cost-benefit analysis was only one of these. So just to put it in, there was a bigger context even to what is value for money. The problem is maybe another whole discussion about that, because cost-benefit analysis is sometimes thought of as the only way of thinking about value for money, but it's actually one of several. And that was part of the communication challenges we faced, was trying to unpack what value for money meant. But I'm going to put that to one side and really talk about the key elements of the methodology. I mentioned about the survey that we used. This was run by Ipsos Mori. I should have said at the beginning that Ipsos Mori were the lead contractor on this. The Tavistock Institute were another partner as well. And we led on the value for money analysis of this evaluation. So there's a very extensive survey that went out on the cost of nature of the services, the number of people reached. We also asked each grantees what percentage of the population they worked with thought actually benefited from the service and what type of services it was. So we didn't assume that everybody who got a service achieved a positive impact, but we took the grantee estimates of that. There were also interviews with 200 stakeholders, grant holders, as a check on the survey data. So just to kind of get some more rich qualitative data on what they were doing, and that sort of really showed the difference between the variety of services that were being provided. Some of it which were very sort of heart-wrenching stuff. Direct frontline services being delivered to people in terrible need at those points. So, and that was on top of the review of the evidence that I talked about that we undertook at the beginning. So I'm going to sort of shoot through some numbers fairly quickly, but that's what the basis was. This survey results supplemented by the evidence, trying to triangulate those. On the cost side, we have this 291 million of costs, mostly coming from the 187 million of the grant funding. We added the value of volunteers as well as a cost resource. Sort of per guidance, and then also estimated funding from other sources as well that topped up that 187. So that was the sort of 290 million in total. The benefits side were broken down into these 4 groups that I've talked about earlier, and I'm going to go through each one just to kind of give you a taste of kind of how we actually calculated these: the staff, the volunteers, the beneficiaries, and the government, of which the big one was the beneficiaries, not surprisingly. So for each of them, the way we worked out with the grant holder staff, and what we really tried to do is just try to create formulas as best we could to deal with the 8,000 grants, right? So it was sort of quite a sort of data-driven formula, quite I say simple. It was never, I wouldn't quite call it simple, but we were trying to make it clear, trying to provide sort of simple formula that people could understand exactly what was being done, as well as do sort of mass calculations as well. So it was really the number of staff multiplied by the value of working in the voluntary sector, the non-pecuniary value. So not their salary, because they get compensated for the time they put in, but there's some value of being in employment above and beyond the salary, estimated as a range between 20 and 75% of salary. We had a middle point of that of 48%. So that gives us our sort of low and high and medium estimate of that. So we just kind of multiply that through. I include here, and I'm just very quickly, the line there, the fifth line down on additionality. This was an attempt to try to make, well, what would have happened if it hadn't been for CCSF? What would have closed down? What services would have closed down? Would they have stopped producing services, etc.? This was all part of the survey that we asked them for, and we used their survey results to come out with these estimates of sort of the counterfactual, or sort of one minus the business as usual. So as I said, I'm skipping through these fairly quickly, just so we leave more time for discussion. Similarly, for volunteers was quite similar for the staff. The number of volunteers times the well-being benefits of volunteers. So we kind of scoured the volunteer sort of literature on the value of volunteering, and then we had to estimate the value of the duration of the volunteering because it wasn't always necessarily clear. So that gave us a range of the estimated value of volunteers of 3.7 to 90.3 million, with a median point of 35 million. And the big one was the value of beneficiaries. Again, we kind of created this formula that we could apply on large, which was the number of beneficiaries multiplied by a kind of a value of their what we call a standardized outcome. So list of that outcomes that I mentioned earlier. We kind of estimated what we thought would be a reasonable estimate of what the value of that outcome would be, and then multiplied that by the number of beneficiaries and the duration over which they expected to have that. This is very, very dense. It's all in the report, but I'd be delighted if anyone went to read the sort of 78-page report that writes all this up. But just to give you a sense of this, what we did with that list of outcomes, and there are 4 outcomes here that we didn't value around sort of dying with dignity, about bereavement, and resilience, that's just really too complicated too difficult to really to value. So for the outcomes for these 8,247 grantees or grant holders, they said, here's how many people we thought benefited in this way. Not everybody benefited, but some people did. We took those numbers and created sort of an estimate of the value of that change. So we started with a sort of a kind of a value of the outcome, and then some relative change in that value, right? So that's the first column, is the value of that outcome. So let's take the third row down, which is physical health was better. We took a quality of life year, adjusted life year, as the basis, and said, okay, what do we think, what might be reasonably expected to be a change in quality from the types of services that were addressing health? And we came between sort of 1 to 5 days. And that was a judgment on our part based on the types of services that were being provided and our review of the literature as well across different sectors on what do we think sort of similar effect sizes might be for the small or medium-sized charities working in this space. So from that calculation, we ended up with these value chains. We applied those to the numbers of individuals. You'll notice that a lot of these sort of fall between sort of 1 to 5%. And get into a discussion about why we picked that, but it was really to do with what generally literature seems to say about the effect size of these types of programs, right? There's not a lot of rigorous evidence, but there are some good studies. So this kind of range we sort of felt sort of fit the evidence when we're applying to a mass set of charities. So that was kind of how we calculated value of beneficiaries. Value of public services was sort of also equally complicated by the very fact that the services being provided did 2 things in a way when it came to public services. That actually some of the information device and the guidance would actually send people to public services, while some other services would actually prevent the need for them or would substitute for them. So we actually had to try to balance out those 2. And again, using the survey data, we came out with an estimate of how many people ended up achieving more public services and those who ended up fewer public services. We came out with a figure of 97,600, and then applied that. There was a savings from 97,000 people not using public services, and we applied different measures of what those costs would be, depending on types of services, to give us that range of value. So it's my last slide. I know I sort of rushed through that, probably lost a number of you, probably sort of glazed looks on your eyes, I'm sure. But I want to kind of give you sort of some of the depth of analysis that we were doing. My last slide here is really that I think that the challenges that we faced on this were similar to challenges faced on any individual CBA project, but except for the increased complexity, potential interaction effects, and we had a number of methodological issues we had to deal with along the way, some of which I touched on, some of which I haven't. But generally, it required us to sort of be quite to sort of force some simplifying assumptions and try to be transparent in how we calculated and presenting it, as well as the time and resources. And it did take a lot of time and resources as well to do that. So that is I'm probably a little bit over. that's my walk through the CCSF. Are there any questions to me directly on that? Anything that was not clear? I know I rushed through it. No questions. Great. It was crystal clear. Brilliant. You can find, as good, someone put that in the chat there, you can actually find that. I'll be delighted if anyone actually went and read that. It was spent an awful lot of time writing and preparing that report. So now really opening us up for broader discussion here. We've had three quite different presentations in terms of the size and the scale, the breadth and the narrowness of what they covered, the quality of data, the absence of data, the sources of data as well. But there were some similarities as well in terms of how we kind of went about these. Fascinating for me because we've not actually talked with the others exactly about how they did it, but I can see some of the similarities and some differences. Are there any questions either from the panel or from the floor? And raise your hand if you have any. Kerry. Hi, Kerry.
Hi, David. Nice to see you. If someone were to pose the question, like, what's the value of doing a whole portfolio approach as opposed to, for example, selecting some exemplars or a sample from your portfolio and doing individual assessments, do you have a response to that, any of the speakers?
Well, Kerry, I can just come in from the Irish example. I think the benefit, what we have learned, is that even though we only had the 7 projects together, what Rethink Ireland were trying to do was to create that coalition of evidence and coalition of voices. So even though that you might have, as you said, an example of maybe 3 of those projects or whatever the case may be, the idea of bringing it together at a fund level created that sense of impetus for policymakers or government to sit up and listen. This actually is a group of people that have something to say. We have this evidence now that we didn't have before. So I think, Tanya, from our perspective, that's the value really, Kerry, from our experience of trying to bring it together in that particular way.
Thanks, Cormac.
And if I can just add one little thing, maybe just as an impact, we continued, after having this, actually, it brought the sector a bit more together. So before these programs are kind of on their own, but after this process, actually, we started to build new initiatives as a result, like community of practice and so on. So basically bringing the voice to hidden sector through an exercise as SROI was probably quite beneficial.
From my perspective, I think that's a very good question. We could have done a similar analysis where someone said, just pick 1 or 2 projects in each of the sectors. And I think that would have been weaker for a couple of reasons. One, the law of large numbers applies. The larger the sample we've got, the more reliable it is. And I suspect people wouldn't have known, we may not have known ourselves whether we cherry-picked good ones or bad ones from that point of view. And if we tried to extrapolate from the ones we studied to try and get a guess for the sector as a whole. But it's an interesting question because it would have had some benefits as well in terms of being able to get more granular about those projects. We did actually there is one set of projects where there are 10 of them and we could only get data on 6. And we asked, and I said to Big Society Capital, it's a reasonable assumption that the other 4 would have performed pretty consistently with those 6 because the most of the variables were similar, i.e. they were addressing similar cohorts with similar interventions, if slightly different, same outcome metrics and everything. But they, to their credit, said, no, we don't want that. It will just expose it to us having inflated the number through an extrapolation that we can't justify. So we stuck to what we had hard data on. which, as you've heard, is a big contrast to poor old David trying to do 8,000 projects with no data at all. But of course, David had the advantage of having a parallel impact evaluation that he could then value, whereas we were trying to, as I explained, trying to base ours on everything from 3 or 4 robust impact evaluations to no impact evaluation at all, just a count of the number of outcomes. So there's pros and cons in all this.
Yeah, let me weigh in as well on this. You know, look, it's a great question. It's a great question about what's the value for money analysis anyway, right? I think there's a debate or a discussion about whether these things really are useful for allocative efficiency or not, which is, here's a better way to spend the money rather than this way. Which is one thing I kind of picked up on, which was the CBA and possibly to a lesser extent SROI is sort of designed to promote allocative efficiency, yet there's actually some resistance on part of practitioners to use it exactly for that purpose. So there's anyway, so there's a bit of an issue there. There is one of the points that I made, which is what's the value of a portfolio versus individual programs depends in part on the interaction effects, which we touched on, but we didn't really get a good grasp. You didn't really grasp properly. I think that's potentially valuable, right? Which is actually, if you fund 5 things that are related to each other, maybe the sum of the parts is more greater. Sorry, the sum of the whole is more than the sum of the parts. You know, there may be also some efficiencies of scale in doing something en masse as well, just pure resources. But a great question. Your own thoughts on that?
I think it's depending on who you're talking to in terms of trying to explain the value of different methodologies, being able to have a response to why the complexities of doing it at a portfolio level are worth doing, I think is important. So it's more for my own, my own intelligence kind of really to use when people are asking questions like that. I think the issue about context and like depth of context is interesting and potentially challenging. And I think that as more and more programs are looking at like systemic and system-wide change and interaction in like a very complex, in a more complex way, I think there's going to then be questions about how does value for money and cost benefit analysis work for that kind of program. So it's sort of just, yeah, those are my thoughts really.
John, you raise your hand. I don't know if that's an answer to that question or you have another question.
No, it's another question if that's okay. Often when we do these kinds of portfolio type evaluations, there's a lot of assumptions required because not the perfect data has been gathered, and that's the reality of the situation. If we were working in a beautiful, perfect world, an evaluator's dream, where you got involved right at the early stage and you had a chance to influence either the shape or the way the project was rolled out or what data was captured, be interested to get a response from each of you on what are the things that you think could have been in place from the start that would allow you to do a much better job.
If I'll go first, if you like, the thing that's hardest for us in the sort of cost benefit analysis we're trying to do is, well, 2 things. One of the things that Cormac and Tanya seem to have cracked, or at least had a good go at, is trying to value soft outcomes. So the UK government has, the Treasury produced some guidance on a well-being year a couple of years ago, which saved me an awful lot of grief. You can now say, if you've got a measure of improved well-being, you can put a value on it, but trying to value those things is very challenging. But the real problem is those consequential outcomes. The research says, there's established literature that says, if you spend time in local authority care, for example, your outcomes in later life will be poorer. But I can't find any longitudinal research that tracks those outcomes over time. I think that would be fantastic. If someone was able to do something like the 7-Up program on TV did and track a bunch of kids who've been in care against a bunch of kids who weren't and extrapolate over 10, 15 years, what actually happened to them, we get better tracking of those outcomes and better understanding of some of that theory of change being established, and that would make it much, much easier. It's just one thing I think would be great to have. So.
Yeah, agree totally, Neil. We mentioned it in our presentation there about that need for the longitudinal data to show the change that happens over time, whether or not, you know, that's sustainable, and whether or not it lasts over time. That's definitely it. John, just another point in time, you might have something else to add, is I think there's something for us learning in it about the capacity of projects, because if you think about what happened, so Rethink Ireland advertised funding, matched funding, projects could apply for that. And as part of that, then they were enrolled, if you like, in an SROI study. And it's like, as for any of us, you know, when you're in a situation where you have to do something that's related to your funding, you do it as part of the kind of day-to-day and so on. But there's probably something on reflection for us, Tanya, and rethink about the time that projects need to actually understand what's actually required, and to build the capacity then to do that, because a lot of the projects, or all of the projects, are flat out doing what they're doing anyway. They're really busy working with people in need. So having this additional piece of work, which is very significant on them, you know, it takes a bit of time to buy into. So I think one of the, if we had a greenfield site and we were starting from scratch, I think a little bit more time for the projects or the awardees to begin to really understand what's involved, and to begin to take it on themselves with us, you know, so that it's not, oh, the evaluators are at us again, even though our projects were fantastic to work with, but it's that sense of, you know, just there's the readiness, if you like, I think, to go. So Tanya, I don't know, do you want to add to that as well?
Yeah, just to add on this, I think the problem is always time, right? Like, I mean, you try to grasp, and you try to gather as much as you can in this period of time. And in the beginning, you have big kind of ideas how this is going to go. And then sometimes you just have to go with the flow and with other people's time and so on. So one thing, if I could kind of like change, is that we would be kind of more present in this process, you know, for the projects. Let's say that we could actually feed in the data maybe more on the go, you know, giving them preliminary data, discussing the data and so on, that they would really understand the process a little bit better. And we try to do this now when we are moving to new funds, but it's difficult, just because you're so stretched, and because you try to kind of pick up different timelines that you are on and that the projects are on. So that's probably one of the things.
Yeah, great question, John. I'm not sure I've got anything to add. I think I was slightly, I wouldn't want every frontline service program to be a research project, you know. So I think it's really about how we create a efficient way of collecting robust research data well, but not everywhere, you know, and then disseminating that, you know. Anyway, that's all my comment.
Just to add one very quickly, one of the real frustrations in the social outcomes sector is nearly all the projects have been a research project, and we still don't have decent impact data. So there are numerous, we've just done a rapid evidence review of homelessness, SIBS and SOCs, and finding high quality data in the UK on impact is very, very challenging. And it's the literature is full of analysis of why we don't have that analysis. I just wish there was a bit more analysis, more effort put into doing it than establishing why they haven't done it. But it is challenging. It's very hard to do, particularly when a lot of evaluators and researchers are called in post hoc and said, can you do a backward facing evaluation? They say, well, no, if we designed a comparator group at the start, we could. But even those who were asked to do it have failed partly because a lot of the projects are too small to get a statistically significant comparator. So it's quite challenging to do. And people don't like the ethical issues, and lots of people on the call will understand all
that. John, any follow-up questions?
No, thank you. That was interesting, just to get people's reactions on that one. Thank you.
Tom, you got a question?
Yeah, thanks. I just, I think it was linked to what you were just discussing, but I wondered if the panel felt that the analysis you conducted led to any lessons for how objectives outcomes are set for a portfolio overall, and particularly the balance between being quite targeted in the types of outcomes that a portfolio is seeking to achieve versus having more wide-ranging options that actually is more like a menu that can be chosen from. And I think I was struck by that, David, in your presentation about some of the outcomes being quite wide-ranging for what was effectively an emergency fund at the time. And I think we faced that in the emergency funds we administered at the Heritage Fund. The original rationale being very strongly to get money out to a sector that was really struggling, but then the evaluation being needing to then also look at a far wider range of outcomes. And that's quite a difficult balance for quite a number of different reasons. From a research perspective, I think in terms of what we were just talking about, if it's quite a wide set of outcomes, you start to spread your research effort quite thinly across those. However, from a grantee and an applicant perspective, that's far more attractive in terms of keeping things flexible. So I wondered whether by running the analysis across these three different schemes, you had any kind of reflections on what the aims should be at a kind of a portfolio level overall in the process of setting those.
Let me take that one first, Tom. For sure, I mean, you're completely right. You know, for an emergency fund, it would have been absurd, I think, if it had been prescriptive, right, as to we now want you to do X and Y and achieve these narrow defined outcomes, given the nature of the context and what the fund was for. So, and that, I mean, as you saw, right, that was very much reflected on how we thought about this, which was like, you know, to make some sensible estimate, we have to aggregate, we have to try to create this sort of synthetic outcome that is broadly applicable to a wide range, that will be wrong as much as it's right in most of the times, but on average, it will be about right when applied to a large number. You know, that was sort of all our thinking. But that's really quite very different from something I think that Neil was dealing with, which is, here is a particular social outcome contract aimed at producing a particular thing with a particular set of benefits. And I think the world can live with both of those. But Neil, maybe you want to weigh in.
Well, I was going to say this particular piece of work, no, but I mean, we've been evaluating the Commissioning Better Outcomes Fund, which is the National Lottery's own support to this type of contract fund, for 10 years with Ecoris. And one of the trends you've definitely seen across these contracts is more and more outcomes being added. So some of the early ones were very simplistic, with one or two outcomes. Someone's in work for 6 months, someone's in work for a year. And they've got broader and broader. So you get something like the Kirklees Better Outcomes Partnership, which is actually funded by a different fund, which is administered by the lottery team, but managed by its government money. That's got, I think, 20 or 30 indicators that are directly measured and paid for under the contract. And that's because of some pushback, I think, from people saying that you have to look at sustainment, you have to look at the soft outcomes for beneficiaries, as well as the hard outcomes for someone who wants to see that payback. And so they're not perfect, but they've got much better because of that. I think they're even harder to administer. And then you get into those capacity issues that Cormac was talking about. So anyone who takes on one of these contracts has got to face that capacity burden. By definition, they've got to count and validate the outcomes or get someone else to do it for them. So, but that's a trend that hasn't really come out for, I'd say, for us. It's just, oh, great, they're all measured, we can just count them. But it's much easier. I've done an exercise specifically on that contract, the Kirklees one, and it's much easier to do it because I've got this really long list of outcomes, and that assumptive task is therefore lower. I'm not having to assume as much. I've got more robust data on more things, and therefore you feel in a quite privileged position as a result. But something my colleague Edward, who's on the call, would say, he's got his hand up, he's probably about to say it, is in all of this, there is a slight risk of spurious accuracy, I feel, because you can get, in all our data, we end up with things like we've got an estimate of prevalence of 83.2%, an estimate of impact of 14.7%, and we multiply that by a number to 3 or 4 significant figures, and it has to be in a range, really. It can't be that accurate some of the time. So I do worry that I always put huge caveats on the front and say these are our best estimates based on assumptions, but people still take them as if that is the exact figure, which leads to that resource allocation issue that David was talking about, that, which I think is one of the most interesting things coming out of this. More and more people, certainly in England, are saying, I need to know what the payback is on this, because I haven't got enough funding to put anything into prevention unless I'm getting a very early payback. So it's become, they're getting harder nosed about it, if I can put it that way, which means the value of this work is higher, but the risk of people getting it wrong is higher as well. Sorry.
I mean, Cormac and Tanya, you even presented a bigger threat, I guess, to this idea of sort of targeted outcomes, which is even when the staff think that the outcomes are targeted, maybe because of what their funding is, the actual beneficiaries see a different set of outcomes anyway. So does it make any sense?
Absolutely, and I think it's a really interesting question, Tom, that you ask, and like looking at and to answer your question, David, as well. Like the aim of the portfolio funds that we had and that we're still working with is on improving the lives of people that have experienced or are experiencing education inequality. So if you think and associated mental health issues. So if you think about the point that you're making there, Tom, is that what we're able to do and what we've been able to do is to identify the hard outcomes. In other words, how many people are progressed through particular programs and so on and so forth, which is great in itself. But more importantly, are the practices and processes that lead to the soft outcomes that underpin those hard outcomes. So in one sense, by quarter one of next year, we will have 30 projects that will have gone through SROI across the 3 funds. And I think, Tanya, I think I'll be right in saying is that the benefit then, to pick up on your point, Tom, is that if you were to go back to the portfolio after running the analysis of all of that, what we would definitely be able to say is, this is what leads to hard outcomes, but really name and talk about the importance of these soft outcomes that were never acknowledged and talked about before. David's point about the peculiarity of the difference and the mismatch between what we found as the project outcomes, if you like, and the participant outcomes, that's interesting. And there's a big debate going on in Ireland at the moment, because a lot of funding has become targeted funding. So you work with black males that are 15 to 25 to do whatever. Whereas it deletes the purpose and the point of universal work in health and social care work. So if you think of youth work, think of education out in the alternative sectors, a lot of that work is universal. And that still has a place, where in others where you deal with things as they emerge nearly on a daily basis. So you have a broad range of things that you're trying to do, but there's also that scope for having to deal with and having to address and help people achieve those soft outcomes that are not maybe in your plan. And that's kind of the messiness of what it shows up for us, is that sense that targeted doesn't necessarily work. Really strict targeted work doesn't work. It's not a definable model, which is a nightmare for policymakers. It has all of these kind of soft edges that make it what it is. And if I Tanya, if you want to add to that, but I think that's my understanding of where we're at.
No, I totally agree. Like it's a massive business on many levels. But I think one thing that it was quite interesting in our case is that we did it bottom up, that we actually went to stakeholders and we were asking them to actually bring us to those well-defined outcomes. So that was maybe a bit different, that we didn't pick from a data set that would be already there, but that basically we were giving them the voice, and they were actually leading us then through this idea of what is valuable to them, if you put it like this. So I think that was very interesting and positive. And now I have to refer to the sector in which we are working, of course, because it is important to this sector. So, you know, if you talk to education, if you talk to policymakers and so on, they always just count hard outcomes. How many people went through the system? That's all they want to see, right? But we very, very clearly saw that if young people don't have the soft skills, as we call it, they will never actually get to hard outcomes, right? And of course, in their own right. I mean, some of them might get to there, some in our own right as we people as we are. But I think this is a contribution in this way that we then try to kind of, more as social scientists, we try to kind of connect the bits, you know, how then these soft outcomes, hard outcomes might lead us into, I don't know, whatever outcome for an individual and the overall society. That would be my view.
Thank you. Ed, I'm wondering, do you still have a question, or did you want to make a point? Or
well, Neil covered it. What's the point about spurious accuracy, meaning when you multiply numbers together and everybody picks same number? But Cormac mentioned something in his talk about how one number had been taken, I think, by the press. Was that right?
Yeah.
And I suppose that's the follow-on question, really, which is how do you avoid having your data, if you like, cherry-picked when you've come up with some aggregated information, and it leads to that then question about how the policymakers who are an audience here review your information. I thought, Cormac, you might have an interesting line on that.
Yeah, so thanks, Edward. I mean, that was one that really disappointed us when we had an official launch and all the media blurb that goes with it and so on, and all of the radio shows and all that stuff that the thing was covered on. I mean, they all started with the return on investment figure, and you know, that was their discussion. And you know, isn't this fantastic? And if we had this in the banking sector, we'd all be wealthy, and you know, all this sort of nonsense talk, without actually getting into the meaning of, well, where did that come from? What does it tell us about the participants at all, or the participants' kind of story? So obviously, we've no control over that, apart from if we're doing the interviews ourselves. But if it's just being picked up on by media, so what we did was to kind of counteract that, Edward. What we did a targeted campaign where we worked with a number of the projects in our national newspaper, the Irish Times, where we actually published first-hand experiences or case studies from the participants as felt by them, and what it meant and how it led to the actual outcome, so that we could refer people then to that, to say, this is kind of what it feels like in the nuts and bolts for, you know, for person X, this is what it actually looked like. So that helped a little bit. And then the other thing goes back to what we were saying earlier on about the capacity for projects. You know, once the projects got their individualized scores and individualized report, we met with them then to try and help them to know, well, what does this mean, and how do you use it in a policy context, or in a context of a fund or whatever. So it's frustrating in a sense that you don't have total control, and obviously you can't, but it's about, I think, the education of the people, and ourselves included, about how best to present this and how to defend you know, the nature of that. It's not just a figure, it's more than that. It's what goes on beneath the figure is kind of what's important. So I don't know if that answers your question, Edward, but
thanks.
I'm tempted to bring in Dan here, because you raised a question, Dan, about the value of well-being measures and maybe some risks. So it's an interesting thing. I mean, certainly in the last 10 years, clearly, and even adopted by Treasury now, about valuing well-being, much more common now. We're talking about soft measures. Has it gone too far, Dan?
Thanks, David. Really interesting discussion. I mean, I'm slightly anxious that it may have gone too far, because people kind of calculating well-beers instead of qual-is, and then people try and work out how many well-beers they've got, and then they take an estimate of what a well-be is worth and then multiply it up. And you start seeing all sorts of people doing this. So there's been work for DCMS that sort of tries to work out what is the value of people going to the theatre once a month. And obviously DCMS are interested in that because they want to pitch to the government, Treasury, for more money. And lots of people are doing this. So I think it's I think it's a slightly spurious accuracy again, to pick up sort of Edward and Neil's points. On the other hand, it's very valuable because a lot of charities, it seems to me, and I think our work at MPC makes it clear, what they're really doing is trying to improve well-being of people. Actually, if you really push them, they sometimes say, you know, the outcome I want is to young people to get into jobs or to deal with mental health or loneliness, but really it's trying to give people a decent life, and well-being is the ultimate measure of that. I'm a massive supporter of well-being. I'm on the board of the Work Centre of Wellbeing. But should we be turning it into numbers? And it's interesting, I put in the chat the blog I did a little while back. I got some quite furious pushback from some of the happiness experts of academics at LSE and so on. So it's quite interesting if you want to follow that up. But so it's an interesting, it's an early phase. It's very good. It's in the Treasury Green Book now and so on. So I think, you know, we all need to work with it and try and get it better. But at the minute, it's just being used by organizations in a very simplistic way, I think. And I think I'm an ex-Treasury person. Quite frankly, somebody comes along to me and they've used well-being and say, therefore it's worth, you know, £1 in 20 back. Hard-nosed people won't do it. So we've got to get this right. But I think it's really fascinating, and we need lots more work in this area.
So can I come in on this one? Because I started the debate really to some extent. The Treasury, this is another case of where people only read the headline and not the detail. The Treasury guidance is quite clear. You can only use it where you've used a robust measure of well-being and I've got a recordable improvement. So we did it for our analysis where there was, I don't know, SDQ or Edinburgh Warwick, something like that, had been used and it had been independently assessed rather than self-reported. But yes, I agree with you. If someone just says, well, there must have been a well-being effect, so let's assume it's 1 month out of a year and a year is 13,600, so therefore it's this, then that is a gross misrepresentation. The Treasury would put it in the bin anyway, because the Treasury wrote the guidance on how it should be used. But what I would say, it was better than what we had to do before, which was either ignore all that value, which is fine. And that speaks to some extent to what Cormac and Tanya have been saying, that all the qualitative evidence that these things are important but can't be valued needs to be taken into account. But what we used to do before, see, I really wanted to put a value on it. So you're using all sorts of hopeless proxies, like were people reaching the threshold for actually having mental health treatment or those sorts of things, which would be a much higher threshold in most cases than most people just changing their well-being, unless they were clinically depressed. So it's not, it's much better than that. I did fall on it like a drowning man, frankly, and say, at least I now have a measure that I can apply in the right circumstances to show that that has happened, because it undoubtedly does happen as a consequence of many of the programs that we evaluate and try to put value on. So I agree it's a complex issue, but I say Cormac and Tanya's work seems to have gone much further, and I'm keen to read it actually, which I haven't had a chance to do, in trying to put some sophisticated values on different subsets of that sort of thing. But I would totally agree also with what they were saying about just the nuance all getting lost. So I'm speaking at the Go Live conference later this week, and I've already decided one of the things I'm going to say is that there's the old adage attributed, I think, to Peter Drucker, that what gets measured gets done, although that's not what he actually said. What gets measured gets managed. But the new mantra to me is what has a value on it gets noticed. And if it doesn't have a value on it, people say, well, I don't believe that. I'd rather have the thing that has a value, which leads to those interesting issues that Cormac was talking about public agents as investors making allocation decisions for good or ill. So how do we get the best out of that without getting the downside out of it, which I see people do all the time, and simplistically say, oh, so investing in that is much better than investing in that. It's a much, much more complex picture.
Thank you, Neil. I'm sure we all agree it's a much more complex picture. I'm 1 minute left here. Are there any burning questions? Because otherwise I'm going to give each of the participants just like 30 seconds to sum up. Like, what does this mean for valuing a portfolio? Or does it, maybe you want to make broader judgments? So, okay, so before everybody leaves, 30 seconds, Tanya or Cormac or both.
Okay, we'll do it between us. Thanks for the offer, David. I think the biggest learning for us is that it's doable, first of all. It has an internationally recognised framework, which has never been used in this place before, in this way before. The coalition of voices is beginning to emerge, and our question is, will fund level SROI lead to a change in policy? That's the question that we're looking at, and a change in the structural inequalities that lead to this problem in the first place.
Neil.
Two things, as I said earlier, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. It is doable and it's worth doing. But on the flip side, as I've just said, do not let simplistic headline analysis drive complex decisions about where and how to invest, including not just investing in specific areas, but as Cormac was saying earlier.
Great. My thoughts, I'm sort of just repeating myself really. I think there is value. I think there is interest of value to value in a portfolio. I think there's maybe a next frontier or another frontier, I guess, of sort of economic cost benefit analysis. The interaction effects, I think, are critical, and really we could benefit from just better quality evidence across the board on which to base things. So that's everything from me. I think people are probably ready to leave. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you very much for Cormac, Tanya, and Neil for participating and giving us your benefits of your thoughts and your experience. And wish everybody the best day.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Thanks all.